You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
What physical basketball is versus
You
physical fouling.
You watch it on YouTube. Anyway.
I saw the game.
I watched the
Well, we're here. I'm Bob Moats. Welcome to X's and Joe's, a podcast dedicated to decoding the winning formula in college basketball.
And I'm Mike Wiemuth, welcoming you to episode 26, Coach Searches and Hires, What to Expect When You Are Expecting a New Coach, recorded on the evening of Friday, February 28th, 2025. So, Bob, well, I guess since the Big Ten expanded into California, I figured our guest list should probably follow suit.
Is Ryan one of the? I mean, I don't know too many people in the great state of California. I think Ryan may be the one at this point. I mean, most of my friends in California, I know at least from where he is in the state. Yeah. So we want to welcome our good friend Ryan Phillips to the pod tonight, and not just a sports reporter extraordinaire, but also a prior owner of a USS Flag, which we have covered before, and just wanted to note that he's a man that knows a thing or two about unicorns, which is kind of what we're going to be talking about tonight with coaches. So, Ryan, welcome. We're glad to see you.
Thanks, guys. I'm glad to be here. I love the show. I've been a fan since you guys kicked it off, and I'm thoroughly thrilled to be here. It was very funny when we were in Bloomington for the meetup. Bob very sweetly asked if I would be interested in doing it. I was like, yeah, of course. And he was kind of shocked that I was interested. What? And I was like, no, yeah, anytime. Come on, guys. So yes, I did own a USS Flag. I think I played with it for about 6 months and then forgot it existed. And it was in pieces in my parents' attic for about 20 years before we got it. I should have just sold it. I don't know. Like, if I had sold that thing, it'd been worth 5 times what my parents paid for it. So yeah, probably one of my life achievements is owning a USS Flag.
So you didn't float it. You didn't float it out in like a creek and then shoot Roman candles at it.
No, not a whole lot of creeks. Creeks are pretty thin on the ground in San Diego, so it was tough to do that.
So it's not a water hazard at the 9th hole, you know. That's
no.
Okay.
Unfortunately, didn't do that. But now that I apparently it has now become one of my life's regrets that I did not do that. So thank you for that.
Well, speaking of California, Ryan, maybe just to tell us a little bit about yourself. How does a suave California kid end up in Indiana?
Well, I grew up I was born in San Diego, moved around a little bit. My dad was an oral surgeon in the Navy. So I was born here. We moved to Orange County when I was 2, then spent 3 years in Okinawa, Japan, as a kid, which I loved, and then moved back here when I was about 7. And so I grew up in San Diego with all the, things you'd expect from being in San Diego. Very lucky to be here. And when I was applying to colleges, I applied to a lot of basketball schools because I was a basketball player. And the first school that replied was Indiana, and I got accepted. Was not on my radar to go there, but it's, I listed off a couple basketball schools. I wound up going to USC out of high school, left after a year and came home and worked for a while and did community college and all that stuff before kind of figuring out what I wanted to do. And Indiana popped back up again. I went there in 2003, never regretted it, loved it, wound up living in Bloomington for about 9 years, working as Bob is well aware at the Columbus Republic. Right out of college, got a journalism degree and started working in a small town newspaper, tale as old as time. And so I that was my connection for Indiana. My mom had traveled through Indiana with her job a lot, knew a lot of people, went to IU and loved it. And so we just went out and visited. And true to the Midwest, it was supposed to be clear skies and lovely, and there was a blizzard with about 10 inches of snow right after we landed. So we drove through that to get to Bloomington, and just really welcomed me with open weather arms there for the kid from Southern California. But yeah, I loved Indiana every minute of it. Bloomington's such a great town. I think it'd be tough for me to live there now, I think, just because I associate it with my college years, but that's how I got there. And I've never, one day regretted my time at Indiana.
Yeah. So I know on the show on Assembly Call, the guys seem to tease you about anything related to USC. Are you in fact still a bit of a vestigial Trojans fan in some way?
Football team, yeah. I knew when I went to school there. Oh, there you go. There you go. Little fight on.
Yeah.
No, when I went there, I lived in athletic housing with a bunch of the freshman football players, and one of them was Carson Palmer. Actually, he lived right below me, and so I became friends with all those guys. And so when I left after a year, I still had a connection to them, and so I followed the football team closely. Became a huge fan. And then right after that was the Pete Carroll years. So I was very connected to that. The basketball team, I never really had. I mean, I love Brian Scalabrine as much as anybody, but he didn't get me to really connect super tightly. I used to play pickup with that guy, and it was not fun.
No.
But no, so I do root for the football team. Indiana's obviously my alma mater. That's priority one. But I do have a deep connection to the USC football team. And so I still follow it very closely and root for it because I had a lot of good sports memories, and especially, the interim years between USC and Indiana. USC's football team was, my one team that was doing great. So I really, really got into that.
So it wasn't like the Padres were really getting you fired up then in that era either.
No, that was a rough stretch. Yeah. Most of their history has been a rough stretch. Trust me, I'm well aware of that. But yeah, I think I've got a bit of an eclectic mix of teams I'm a fan of as far as success. But I will say I do believe I brought my fandom curse upon Indiana because I got there in 2003 and it has not been good since. A couple outside of a few fluky years. It's been a pretty negative downturn, which hopefully we're going to turn around here in the next few months.
Ryan, don't worry, it's not your fault. Just remember when Bob Moats arrived in Bloomington.
True. That was the watershed moment where everything just went downhill.
What year?
1993.
Oh,
I was there. I was the group that I was Calbert Cheney graduates college. I show up in Bloomington, and now we're in 30 plus years of pestilence. So you're welcome, everybody. I'm glad to have been a part of this.
Hey, they got to a championship game in your time. I was right. It's so funny. I go ahead.
Right. No. I mean, you're right that it was like that was the one, like one of those fluky things where it's like you roll. I remember running down 4th Street in Columbus, Indiana, chanting "Duke sucks" after watching the game in my apartment with 5 of my friends. And then for the next games, everybody went back to the exact same seats to watch the rest of the tournament. So that was how just bizarre that time was.
I was bartending in San Diego during that game at a sports bar, and everybody in that place was an Indiana fan for the day because it was Duke, and the place went absolutely nuts when Indiana won. Again, no connection. Next game, they weren't rooting for Indiana, but that night, everybody was an Indiana fan. And the funny story that I've told this on Assembly Call is the week that I went to visit Indiana. It was a year before I wound up going there, but this is when I went to visit that blizzard night that I've told you guys about. It was the week between the Sweet 16 or the Elite 8 and the Final Four. And so like everybody on campus was buzzing. We get there and we go to the Chili's over on the east side. And my mom, we're staying over there. My mom was just like, let's just go get something easy. Let's just go to something easy. We'll go to Chili's. And we go to Chili's. Shout out Chili's. It's free advertising. And we get seated, and it's a long wait because everything on Bloomington on like can be a long wait when everyone's on campus. And we get seated, and my mom and I have my back to the group behind us, and my mom just says, Ryan. And I can't hear. It's busy. I'm like, wait, what? She says, look behind you. And there's somebody sitting behind me with a hat that has a net sewn into it, like tied into it. And it was Tom Coverdale was sitting with his family directly behind me on my visit to the school. And I was like, that's a sign. I think that's
from God.
Sign.
That's a sign. That's a divine sign right there. Yeah. So, okay. I'm coming. Yeah.
Yeah. And so and I knew I'd been following the whole thing and I knew that I could potentially go to IU. So I really had adopted them a bit. And I looked behind me and it's just like, that's Tom Coverdale. That was my first Indiana basketball experience was right after the Duke. And I think it was Kent State in the Elite 8 game. And then, that was that.
Yeah. Remember, there may have been a mannequin that was being put out on 4th Street that night. I was in Chicago. My friends went to the apartment to sit in the spots, and they had a drowning dummy for lifeguards that they were putting out in the middle of the street and putting underneath cars. That's the stuff that I missed when I that night. But I'm telling you, that was about 2 weeks of absolute just amazing hijinks. Bunch of guys in their mid-20s just running rampant for 2 weeks because we don't know what else to do with ourselves.
Bob, do you remember where I was working remotely around that time?
Were you in Rhode Island? No, you were. No, where were you?
I was in Philly area, but I was doing back and forth between Philly and Raleigh, Durham.
Right.
Oh boy,
I was there that next Monday, and all the Duke grads who had been trash talking me all the prior week were literally diving into their offices to avoid me.
I forgot about you working for those guys.
Yeah. Avoid that guy at all costs.
That night was when Rupp Arena is exploding with UK fans cheering for IU. Like there were a bunch. Kentucky, Big Blue Nation, for the only time in maybe history, became IU fans for an evening because they finally found a school they hated worse than us.
Yeah. I mean, that's fair. And at that time, Duke was that school for everybody. Yeah. I think it's less so now. One, Coach K isn't there anymore, but it's just, their dominance hasn't been as profound as it was during that stretch in the 90s. And so it's kind of been a ways since that. Like, Kansas has more success than them recently. Right. Other schools have, Villanova even. And so it just has lessened that like evil empire feeling. But at that time, it's hard to describe to people now who weren't following college basketball back then just how everybody outside of that school hated Duke.
And how loathed because of the way they were, and just kind of that arrogance, that cockiness, like the J.J. Redick and Christian Laettners. They were not lovable characters. These were not warm, fuzzy college basketball players that you really, really loved, unless they were even on your team, and even then, we're not really sure you loved them that much.
Well, it was like something like 13 years in a row, Duke had the most hated college basketball player on the roster. Like it was a different guy every year, but
every year.
Yeah.
So speaking of the heady days of the early 2000s, it's time to talk about, because now that's vintage, guys. I know that kind of depresses me. It makes me want to cry a little bit when I think of it. But let's talk about our title sponsor, Home Field Apparel, who again is always releasing new and exciting vintage looks for a variety of schools, including Duke, including Kentucky, and especially Indiana. And if you get a chance to kind of check out the website, or the app, you can see kind of what they have available right now going into the spring season and into T-shirt and hat season, as we like to say. And especially with March Madness around the corner, check out Home Field for all of your vintage apparel needs at www.homefieldapparel.com.
And when we come back, we'll discuss how we navigate the wall of sound and silence in a coaching search. Next on X's and Joe's.
And welcome back. So Mike has been describing this, and it was a very interesting analogy when you brought this up. The whole idea of a coaching search being analogous to the concept of Schrodinger's cat. The idea that you don't really know. And so I'm going to kind of throw it over to you to kind of explain that a little further as to how the coaching search is like a cat in the box.
Sure. Yeah. So Schrodinger's cat, I think it was made popular again on The Big Bang Theory, but just explain it. It's a thought experiment developed by an Austrian scientist named Erwin Schrodinger. Basically, the idea is a cat is placed in a box with a device that has the potential to kill the cat, but it's not guaranteed, meaning that until you open the box and observe the cat, could be considered both alive and dead at the same time, owing to the lack of transparency, which is concealed by the box. So years back, I basically started to use this metaphor for coaching searches, since they basically operate under somewhat the same premise. As fans and media and just neutral observers, we're all staring at the box in some desperate attempt to make sense of what's going on inside the box in advance of it actually being opened. And in the sense of it being opened is when the coach is actually announced for the school. So I've framed it that way for, I guess, so many years now. And I think it would help that the Big Bang Theory actually started to make that, actually started talking about that. So now people actually connect. Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's, I think it's because social media especially has just exacerbated all of that to the point where now every little scratch that people think they hear inside the box is now just completely just blown up times 100 on social media, on Twitter, on Discord, to the point where it's just hard to make any sense of actually what is happening inside the box, especially when you're dealing with an athletic director that's actually doing a pretty good job of keeping things quiet.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that to me, as I'm kind of looking at this and kind of going through the whole idea of us, and IU fans have a lot of practice at this whole blending social media. Used to be message boards, and then to social media, to whatever's out there with the discords. The sort of collective hysteria and insanity. I do believe we're the ones who first figure out how to use Flight Tracker in a coaching search. I think we should probably get royalties for any fan base. The school should just send us a check for that. Or talking about horse farm, we'll get that later. But I think that there's that element of just insanity where people are literally chasing private planes, taking pictures of them. And then also, I think what's happening on the media side of things. And Ryan, I mean, being that you're in this business, knowing that you're looking at the box and you're trying to figure out what's going inside, how do you in particular, and maybe others in the field, look to this, and how do you kind of figure out what's going on and what you can tell the rest of the people all huddled around this thing, waiting to see what's going to happen?
Yeah, I think one thing we have to, and I'm loath to ever attack any reporters, and I wouldn't name anybody by name, but some people believe whatever they are told and whatever they hear. And you see that, and that's how, entire fan bases get led one way when that's not the truth. I think there are several rules you go by. The first is never believe an agent. And never once believe what an agent tells you.
Wait. You're telling me that they have a vested interest in their client?
Yes. Yeah.
And that they're not being transparent as to what they're really wanting?
Yes. I hate to break that, veneer for everybody, but yes, agents are incredibly self-interested, obviously. And many, will float a coach's interest in a place solely to get a monetary reward from the place he's currently at. And so anytime you hear something like that, and then a guy turns around and signs a contract where he's at, just understand that it was likely garbage. It was stuff you pick up on that horse farm, is what it was. But I think that's number one. And then number two is understand that any information you're getting, unless you have a personal friendship with somebody, like a very close personal friendship of somebody you trust, anything you're getting for a reason. And whether it's from the athletic department, whether it's from, again, an agent or a coach or, somebody who might be a third party to the whole situation, there's a reason that information is being leaked. And so you have to you really have to check closely before reporting definitively. I remember years ago, somebody reported that Indiana had a deal with Steve Alford done. And I made one phone call and debunked that. And you can't debunk anything with one phone call. But it was somebody who said, yeah, he's not even being considered. I don't know where that's coming from. Well, there's a reason why that was floated. And other thing, so I think that coaching searches, as much as anything, are incredibly difficult because you don't want to report something that will hurt somebody who, let's say, for example, somebody floats that Coach A is interested in Indiana's job. Well, Coach A already has a job, and you are potentially putting him in a very difficult spot at his job if that story is not true. You're making it look like, to the fan base, to recruits, to players on his team, like he's looking around to leave. And so you have to be very careful what you report. Secondly, when you report Coach A is interested in Indiana, and if it's somebody great, Indiana's fan base gets real excited about it. You better be sure. And I think it's a very difficult situation to be in as a reporter to make sure that you have this locked down. There's been stuff reported in past coaching searches where I have privately told these somebody call guys, I wouldn't have reported that because it's out on a limb and you're putting yourself in a real bad spot. And the other thing is your credibility is at stake every time you report something. And, people will forgive a mistake, but they won't forgive a lot of mistakes. And your reputation depends on your accuracy. And again, people get things wrong where maybe they were reporting the correct thing, but the situation changed. And that's not the result that they, that was the situation a few days before, and they look like they got it wrong. Well, you can't do that too much or people just tune you out. And so it's very difficult. I think that a lot of the reporting that comes out afterwards is the most accurate because the situation is settled, the landscape is settled. You can talk about those things, but in the moment, everybody's got a different version of events. And I think that everybody close to a situation will have a different version of events too. Right. Brad Stevens almost, he's close. He's on the verge of, this is the last time he's on the verge. Well, no, he's not going to leave the Celtics. Like those clashing things, we'll never know exactly where the truth lies because you talk to 5 different people, you get 4 different opinions. And so I do think it's a very difficult spot for a reporter to be in. I'd imagine it's a lot like, free agency for Major League Baseball or something like that. And there's a reason why the best people always get the right report and why it's the same. It's usually the same people every time. It's because it's very difficult and they're very good at it. And they're very good at parsing through the BS.
And I would, this coaching search at IU in particular is fairly unique in that you're looking at a situation where we're not talking about a fervency of about 14 to 20 days, which is usually what you're working at with the coaching. We're talking months. Like we're 16 days away from St. Patrick's Day, which is around that time where right after Selection Sunday, where you start getting movement in these stories. Usually, we've actually been talking about a new coach construct at IU for a year now for a variety of different reasons. And now we're talking about seriously being in a quote coaching search of which there may be nothing or very little of substance actually going on because of the nature of what's happening at this point in time. We don't know what's going on in the box. Only a handful of people, we could probably count on at most 2 hands, the amount of people that actually know really enough to say anything, I would say. And I think the one person who does is Scott Dolson and maybe his secretary. And after that, I'm not sure that too many people inside Assembly Hall really know a whole hell of a lot about what's going on, as well as any of the people that they're talking to inside the search firm and even maybe some of the coaches or their agents at this moment on very preliminary conversations. So now you have a siege when you're really looking at a blitzkrieg type of, usually a blitzkrieg type of process. And if you're getting all weed up and fired up on February 10th, thinking it's going to happen now or something's happening now, I think you're setting yourself up for an extreme disappointment.
Well, and one thing that I think is worth noting, and I know this brings it back to the USC connection, but I think it's poignant. USC let Clay Helton go long before the season was over.
Right.
And they hired Lincoln Riley over a weekend. It was, and the thing is, coaches who you might have perspective talks with, and you might create that connection through back channels, but a lot of them don't want to talk until they get a break, until maybe conference tournament time or after conference tournament before that break before the tournament. Like they're not going to want to go all out talking about their next job while they're currently have a team playing. And Lincoln Riley, from the way I understand it, USC approached him during the season or through back channels. It's never a direct phone call. And he said, I got a team to coach right now. I don't want to think about that. And after the Big 12 championship game, he then was willing to talk, and they hired him in about 3 days. They had another coach basically on standby, ready to go when Riley said, I'll do it. That's most coaching searches are a guy gets some back channel, contact, thinks about it for a while, then actually talks about it. And that's probably what's going to happen here. So anybody expecting really fast movement in the next couple, like 2 weeks, is going to be disappointed. This is going to play out. And I would imagine late March is when you're going to find out. Now, Indiana, I think, will be at the front of the line of the coaching moves that happen, but it's not going to happen for a while. And what happened with Miami getting an assistant from is much different than what's going to happen with Indiana, because Indiana is going to hire a head coach from somewhere else. And I think that that's, pretty much, I mean, look, that's a prediction, but I think it's a pretty safe assumption that that's what's going to happen. And whoever they pick is somebody you would hope is still playing, is still coaching at that time, and is still coaching until, and it won't be announced until that team season is over. That's the way it goes. That's the way it always will be, because he doesn't want to be somebody, next coach doesn't want to be somebody who's ditching his current players to go to the next spot. And so even if a deal is struck beforehand, or a, sort of a wink, wink, nod, nod, this is who it's going to be, is struck beforehand, you won't hear about it until after that team season's over. So, because the coach won't want that to leak. You want to punish his current team. And here's the other thing. In this day and age of transfers and NIL, there might be players on that team he wants to bring with him to his next spot, and he doesn't want to piss them off. So I think that Indiana fans have to have patience. This is a unique situation. Not completely unique, but unique to past Indiana coaching searches, is that this has been announced for a couple weeks now. And people are getting a little antsy about, why isn't there a movement? Why aren't there more rumors? Because that's not the way this works. Right now, they're vetting people, probably making back channel contact, but this is not going to be something that's settled for a while.
Yeah, I'm curious, Ryan. We were talking about information and, I guess, in some ways, disinformation that takes place during the process. I'm curious about reporters maybe being used almost like part of something like Operation Mincemeat from World War II. Like,
love that book, by the way. Love that book.
Yeah. But reporters being sort of like used for effect for the sake of, let's say, like a coaching candidate. But also, I guess, even thinking about in the context of fans overreacting to the information that they're hearing from reporters. I think I posted something earlier this week about just how the volume of certain candidates coming up within a search does not usually actually correlate to where they sit in the actual position with the athletic director. I mean, coaches who know that the top of an AD's target list typically don't require their media pals to run whisper campaigns for them, and in terms of their candidacy for that job. So I'm curious about, like, if you're a reporter and you know that there's some, whether it's an agent or a coach themselves, that is trying to get their name out there, and they know that, okay, I'm not in the top 3. I'm like number 7 in the list. But if I can just get my media pals, if I can possibly gossip girl my way towards the top 3 and be part of the interview process, if I can just maybe get some people to start mentioning me as a reporter, like how do you sort of vet that in terms of your responsibility to report accurate information, but also knowing in the back of your mind, okay, this guy's telling me something. I know it's technically news-ish, but there may be something going on here that is, beyond just the reality of the situation.
Yeah, I think that it's how you frame it. It really is. And like, if you're getting heat from a coach and their people that they're interested in the job, you can report that you found that they're interested. Reporting two-way interest, unless you know it for sure, is unethical. And is, and I think that, there was a whole, I believe it was the Woodson search. I think it was. I can't remember if it was Woodson or Miller, because we've had so many now, but I think it was Woodson. There was Chris Holtman's name came up, and that was very plainly an agent throwing his name into the mix to try and get an extension with Ohio State. It was plainly obvious, but a number of people fell for it, and a number of people reported that Indiana was gunning for Chris Holtman. And you talk to people behind the scenes who are like, they would talk to Chris Holtman if he wanted to like have that conversation. And at the time, Holtman was a highly regarded coach at Ohio State doing a really good job. That fell off very quickly, but his name was floated as being like Indiana is pursuing him. And the people at Indiana were like, not really. I mean, we talked to him if he's interested, but we just figured he was set at Ohio State. We weren't even going to go after him. Right. And so that wound up being an agent floating his name to media people and saying, oh, Indiana's coming after him. And that turned into a whole thing. It was about a 24-hour, story. And it was solely for the benefit of the coach and the agent. It had nothing to do with Indiana. It didn't help Indiana. I got calls from people in the athletic department because I tweeted out, like, this feels like an agent angling for an extension. And I got a number of calls who were like, that's exactly what it is. We hadn't even talked to him. Like, and they said, like, we like him. We'd love to have a conversation with him, but there's been no contact. And so I think that stuff like that, you really do have to have your ducks in a row when you're reporting it. People are going to get tricked. They're going to get lied to. It's going to happen, and you're going to make honest mistakes. And I think that there is this feeling in the world that reporters can never be wrong. And it's like, no, everybody has a bad day at their job. Mm-hmm. Every single person has a bad day at their job where they think they're doing the right thing and mess something up. We have to have grace for that. Mm-hmm. It's your track record that matters. I mean, I have years ago, I said I thought that Phil Jackson would be the guy to turn Kwame Brown around. I pounded my hand on the table saying that he will turn Kwame. That was a bad call. It was a very bad call. I would hope that nobody is going to judge me on that for the rest of my life. And the track record is what matters. So, I mean, things that you mess up, it happens. It's about, not doing that often and being as careful as possible when reporting information. And, I think that there's a lot of people who cover IU who do a very, very good job. Yeah. And I think that Indiana fans are lucky to have those people and to have this media group. I mean, there's a lot of great, to be fair, I'm sitting on a lot of great podcast content, a lot of great fan content. And then there's also a lot of great reporters working who do a very, very good job. And people are going to mess up. But it's about looking at that track record and understanding that these people are good at what they do, and they typically will not report something unless they're pretty sure.
Mike and I, we can go back on, because we go back on this over years of understanding and discerning the difference between analysis, news analysis, and news reporting. That when you make a Kwame Brown prediction, that's analysis.
Yes.
If you're saying Brad Stevens was sitting in, took a family vote and it was 2-1 against, and you don't know that's misreporting. And
it is.
There was a moment where I was kind of sitting, through the Stevens fever dream that we were all kind of going through.
Which time? This time or last time?
Both times. But this time in particular, there was a moment in this conversation where I just went back to the 1980 Republican National Convention when they were rumoring Jerry Ford was going to be the vice president. And I mean, I've actually, because I have nothing better to do with my life other than raise my kid, coach basketball team, talk with you guys, do my job, not necessarily in that order, I might add.
No, of course not.
But I'm watching. I've actually had it on the background and listening to that, and just the fever dream of networks trying to report out and trying to be the first one to say Jerry Ford's going to be the VP nod, is going to get. And I mean, they're all like on the precipice because every Republican is there is saying, well, I've heard from a guy, I've heard from a source, I've heard from a guy that's in the room. And I keep thinking, I'm reading this crap on Discord. I'm seeing this stuff. Messages are hitting my phone. They're hitting Mike's phone. They're hitting your phone, Ryan. I've heard. There's this guy, and he knows this guy. He knows that guy. And then all of a sudden, it's like Reagan is standing up front going, it's going to be George Bush. And everyone goes, oh.
You want the good story. Everybody wants the good story.
And I think that there is that thing of you want the good story, and you want to be the, I think oftentimes people, I'm the guy that knew it. I knew it. I have this. And it's like, in this situation, and this is where, we talk about like the horse farms and the flight tracking and all of these things of, can I be the one that undoes, can I be the Woodward and Bernstein in this situation? Can I find out, or better yet, can I be the person who figures out who Deep Throat is and gets them to commit to it? It's that sort of thing where we have so many people out there who are just so vested. I think in many respects, it's a kind of a testament to the craziness of our fan base. And it's like, if we are this invested in, I don't know, trying to figure out which agent is talking to which member of the athletic department at this given time. Just imagine that collective harness energy going behind a team that's winning 30 games a season. I mean, just imagine how much that's going to be an attribute to your program when you actually have something to cheer about versus looking for something to cheer about. And if you're spending that much time looking for something to cheer about, you're going to find something that when it's time to find something to cheer about, you're going to cheer about it. Mm-hmm. So there is something about that being that invested. And yeah, during the off time, we're arguably the most meta fan base on the face of the earth. We talk about talking about ourselves more than we actually talk about the product on the floor more times than not. Fair. It's kind of what we do. But there is that thing where the horse farm rumors kind of kick in, and then you see the hot boards and the conversations around those. You know, a lot of this is harmless. It's just there is that point though where sometimes you may be forcing someone's hand a little too quickly. That's my concern with it, is if you get that fever pitch to a certain degree, maybe that thing collapses a little faster, and maybe had you given another 48 to 72 hours, it might have missing a little more daylight. That would be the only concern I'd have.
Yeah, and I think it's the nature of the 24-hour news cycle that started decades ago, but has been brought to our doorstep with the internet. I mean, at 3 a.m., you can go on any message board and read anything you want to read. And every opinion in the world is, in your hand now. You don't have to log on and dial into a really shady internet connection, that might be sputtering to find out information. You can just look down at the palm of your hand and find whatever you want. I think that things move so much faster now because of that. And I know I sound old talking about the olden days where, you actually had to wait for the newspaper the next day to know what was going on. But that wasn't that long ago. It really wasn't in the grand scheme of things. And I think that people's brains can't handle that the constant rumor cycle yet. And the ones who can, God bless you. It's too much sometimes. It's overwhelming. And it's overwhelming to the people involved too. I mean, if a coach is going to have a conversation with Scott Dolson and it gets out the next day, or hours later, that's not great for that coach, because if he doesn't get picked, it devalues his brand, and it and if he turns down the Indiana job, it devalues the Indiana job. So there's just so much information that people try and keep hidden, and very little information does, continue to be hidden these days. I do respect the fact that Scott Dolson is doing this quietly. It seems the way he has always operated has been very quiet. The Steven stuff last time got out. There are so many different versions of that story out there. What I can say is that that's who he went after. And it was very obvious, and he went after him very hard. And I think he was a little exasperated after it didn't work, because he thought, if I give you all of this stuff, the Celtics aren't really good right now. This could be your last year, maybe a year and a half as the head coach. If I give you everything, if I hand you everything on a platter that you want, you'll come. And he didn't. And honestly, I have said after that one, I thought that was probably his last chance to get it. Now, this time around, I heard some rumors that he might, and again, it's hearing rumors from people who know him, that he might listen. And if they talked, but it's the kind of thing where the Brad Stevens things, we need to put that to bed. He's turned the job down twice, and he's never he knew this time around, if he said no, he's never getting a shot at the Indiana job again. So it's, that's over. But that's that fever pitch of information. And I think that, I do respect coaches who come out and say, like, before they're even connected to a job, if somebody asks about it and they just say, no, I'm happy where I am. It has nothing to do with that job. It's a great job. But, Nate Oates did that very quickly. He's like, no, I'm staying at Alabama. And that kind of stuff. So it removes them from having to be connected to this cycle. It's self-interested, but it also calms things in that way. And until you hear from people that it's a no, the pull of Indiana, the resources, the finances, the NIL power, all of that stuff, Indiana's a better job from that perspective than most in the country. It just comes back to where guys are comfortable. And just because it's a better job doesn't mean a guy's going to leave where he's comfortable. So all these connections, all of that stuff, you never know. But also, as a news consumer, always take something in a coaching search with a grain of salt.
Good point.
Yeah, and you think about it as fans, we're always, to some degree, steeped in motivated reasoning.
Of course.
Right.
Right.
We're just
that's why we're fans, right? We're not all stockbrokers.
Yeah, and yeah, you think about it, especially if you're talking about a program, because whenever you're doing a coaching search, typically it's coming off of, in most cases, it's coming off of a coaching regime that failed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
the guys being
almost
fired.
always, yeah.
Yeah, so it means that the team's not doing well, which means that the fan base is already kind of primed for going out of their way mentally to arrive at a happy destination. And what you notice is that all the crazy conspiracies, Bob said the horse farm theories and things like that, and people desperately tracking flights across the country. You notice that doesn't happen with the option C candidates.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Has anyone seen any rumors about a flight going from like Bloomington to Evanston, Illinois?
I just assumed that some north suburb. I would just assume that some kid from the north suburbs wanted to go back for a decent pastrami sandwich.
You take the train from Indy to Chicago, and then you take the L on the purple line out there, and you just under the cover of darkness.
Right. Yeah. Or you just rent a university car and you drive up and take the Dan Ryan right square to Evanston.
I'd love to see Dolson and Quinn Buckner locked in a car together for 4 hours. What are those guys talking about after everything that's happened? What are those guys talk about for 4 hours locked in a sedan?
And who drives?
Dolson's driving.
Dolson's driving. It's got to be
Quinn probably sit in the back.
Just on his phone 4 hours. So the other part of this, I think, comes into when stuff starts moving. And I think, Ryan, you hinted at this, and it's, I think, the truth, because IU's out first. Hypothetically, IU gets filled probably very early in the cycle, just based on.
Unless I'll say, to caveat that, unless it's a much lower tier job, IU will get filled first, I think.
Right.
Of the big ones that are available, I would say that. Unless they bring up a candidate from a much lower tier for some of these others.
If the butterfly flaps, it's a big enough butterfly to flap the wings to start the dust, it creates the hurricane, is where I'm going with this. That if you kind of go into that sort of idea that we have this would be a big enough profile to actually be, and sometimes it works in reverse. Like, I think, the best butterfly example you can come up with was when Dean called Roy home. And Roy gravitates back to Chapel Hill. Self goes from Illinois to Kansas. Bruce Weber goes from Southern Illinois to Illinois. Matt Painter takes over at Southern Illinois for that one season. And as a result of this weird merry-go-round, you had, I think, 3 generational coaches out of 4 that ended up getting kind of their hit based on that flap of the wings when Matt Doherty basically fell on himself and fell into a pile of horse, and it fell on the horse farm. And all of a sudden, now how the hell does this happen? And I think around that same time, IU was looking, was that what, 2003, 2004? Was that
around there? Yeah.
2004.
I think 05 Roy brought, it was 04, 05 Roy brought North Carolina to Bloomington.
Right.
So it would have been before that. Yeah.
Right. So and Mike Davis was just finishing up then at that point, I believe.
He finished in, his last was 05, 06.
Okay.
It was my senior year at Indiana.
Right. So we had
sitting in the front row of that press conference was fun.
I mean,
I can imagine.
I look at that sort of, but then the other thing is, you see what happened last year. Another seismic event happens that was completely weirdly orchestrated, where Andy Enfield is going to get fired at USC, or maybe he did get fired, ends up at SMU. Musselman somehow, I think, engineered that to go. There was some word about that somehow he tried to convince Enfield to take the SMU job. He jumps to USC. I mean, I don't know if, again, that's just stuff you hear after the fact. So now you have Musk goes to the Big Ten to Southern Cal, and then the floodgates open when Calipari says, "I'm out at Kentucky. The lifetime contract isn't good enough for me. I'm done. I'm going here." He ends up in Fayetteville, and then here comes Mark Pope after there, which is again probably going to be a very good hire for them. I
Yeah,
think
I would
early on,
expect so.
I would think so, that over the long haul, he's going to do something there. That could become a generational hire for them too. But, you also saw the UK fan base lose their minds when it wasn't Nate Oates, when it wasn't.
Right up until the point that they had was it the 96 team or the 98 team? I don't remember. Get off the bus in the arena. Then they all kind of turned around on that one. That was
they kind of, but I still was catching from like some of their sort of fan sphere where it's like, why can't we land another shoot the moon type candidate?
Calipari. Yeah.
Right. And I do think that moonshot candidate, this is where IU is right now. And we'll talk about this, I think, probably a little more in 2, but I'll just go ahead and just knock it out now. I think IU is looking for a moonshot candidate. I think that's really what the plan is. That's the one thing we haven't tried. That's the one thing this program hasn't gone for. It's gone for, okay, screw it, we're winning. Screw it, we're going to go get Cal. Screw it, we're going to go get Roy. Screw it, we're going to go get the best guy on the table that might be able to move off.
Yeah, and I think that's what they were trying to do with Crean. I know that was a move up technically, but it was a guy who had won at a pretty high level, and had the energy and all of that stuff, and was a very well respected coach. Had come up through Izzo's school at the Izzo school at Michigan State. Kind of felt like they were going for success there. I mean, you could even say Kelvin Sampson, when he was at Oklahoma, was a winning coach. Like that wasn't as big a step up as people acted like at the time. No. It was almost a step over to, a top 10 job from a football school, but that football school, basketball school thing doesn't really exist as much as it used to, I think, given how much money is being thrown around everywhere. But I think that they tried that there. Crean was a step up, but not a steep step up. And since then, the last two have been huge steps up. And I think that they're done doing that. I think that if you had to predict who the next coach of Indiana would be, they're going to get somebody that is won, or their aim to. I don't know if they'll say yes. I mean, but their aim is to get somebody who has won at big time college basketball. And I would imagine who is offensive minded, based on what they've tried before the last 2 times and hasn't worked. I think they will go for somebody who is an offensive minded head coach who has won it at the college basketball level, and not one made a couple nice runs in the tournament, but has consistently shown that they can build a program to win. I would expect that is who they will go for. And again, I would expect offense first.
So let's go ahead and we're going to do a quick little flip here, and we'll do this in the show notes later, because we're going to kind of talk about something else in a moment. So let's talk about, Mike, your theory of opposites, because I think this is a perfect time just to get into that.
Yeah. So, I would agree with what you said, Ryan, in that it's something we actually see in the data. Like if you go back through history in college football and college basketball, and you've probably seen this yourself, being from the position that you sit, athletic directors typically, when they're firing a coach for performance issues, they will typically avoid hiring a coach that has generally the same weaknesses as the coach they just fired. And that, again, as Bob said, that's something I just generically call the theory of opposites. You fire a coach that was, let's say, didn't have much personality and was like a defensive minded coach. More times than not, the next guy that they're going to, maybe not the guy they hired, the guy they're shooting for.
Yes, that's a key thing to mention. Yeah.
Right.
The guy they're going to be shooting for is probably, if you're going to bet money, going to be enthusiastic and loves to score.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and that's basically dovetails with what you said, and I totally agree. And I did a pod with Alex Bozich last night, where we talked in detail about that. Indiana's definitely going to be targeting, I think, if they can, an offensive guy, a guy that focuses on offense, because you just thinking about the fan base. And I think what the reason the theory opposites applies is because, especially in Indiana's case, because not only have you had one coach that has run an offense that doesn't score much, or doesn't score effectively or doesn't hit threes, especially, which, obviously bothers Indiana people. You've had 2 coaches in a row that have had that issue.
Right.
So now the pressure to switch to something that's going to be different, that's going to entertain the fan base and get back to actually hitting 3-point shots, is going to be very intense for this hire.
Well, and I would throw out that also you're looking at someone that, we've not seen, and maybe, Crean was the last one that really did this to any sort of efficacy, because not just because he had the players to do it, but because he actually built a team that could do it.
Yeah.
Was use of dribble penetration. And the fact that we haven't had the last 8 years of offense has been so dependent on passing, trying to get the ball into either the post or just trying to force the ball places versus just flowing and trying to just, again, getting good striking actions and then getting secondary hits off of those actions. We're seeing that you're probably not going to, like if you're looking for a guy that's going to be going to the post 15% of the time, that's probably not going to be the guy Indiana's looking for. If you're looking for someone who's has kind of more of a flex view, more of that, or a Princeton or a flex type view of offense, where they're looking to, again, more of a passing game construct versus getting drivers and shooters that space the floor out and attack. I really think that I use at a point where, and this is I just described every successful team in college basketball right now. That's what they do now. This is what the game's, and the game should have gone into this, where it's definitely less how do you design a systemic offense to how do you get guys in the right spots and then get the ball in to force defense to respond to you, which is why I think, Mike, you mentioned that, in the last national champions, all 10 of them had higher offensive levels and defensive levels rankings.
10 years in a row. Now the national championship winning team has a higher adjusted offensive metrics than adjusted defensive metrics. And back in the day, like if you go back at least like a decade or so, back into the earlier 2000s, you had a little bit more switching back and forth. One team would be more defensive oriented, the next one would be offensive oriented. Now 10 times in a row, the teams that lean offense, they're stronger offensively versus defensively, are winning the championship.
Yeah, and I want to say the last 8 years, to me, has felt like a lot of one-on-one offense, whereas good teams these days play team offense. Right. Instead of just clearing it out, let one guy on Indiana do what he's going to do, throw it into the post one-on-one, dribble drive one-on-one. Some passing oriented stuff, but it's usually to get very specific guys shots. And good offenses in college basketball, everybody can hurt you. And I know that's it seems like a dumb thing to say because obviously everyone could hurt. No, but you have to have a balanced attack to win these days. And Indiana has not had balance for 8 years. And even in Crean's last few years, on and off, it was very tilted towards the perimeter. Right. After Cody Zeller, and then, Noah Vonleh didn't turn out to be the offensive force that they thought he would be. He was a very good player, but not, that level. Thomas Bryant provided that, but it was hit and miss at times because he was so young. I think that what you have to have is a balanced offense led by guards. And that has not been the case at Indiana for 8 years. And I think, they've got some players who can do some things now from the guard position, but the offense doesn't fit them, and it hasn't fit them. And that has led to a, decrease in their ability to actually do what they've been brought in to do. And so I do think that is going to be the case, that it will be offense first. And I would say, I think that they hired Mike Woodson based, and a lot of his reputation was he's really good with players. He's really good with the media. He's really interesting and entertaining and all that. And they expected a more, as you talked about, just a more, entertaining guy as a head coach. And he didn't really take that mantle, probably because I don't think he understood the pressure cooker he was stepping into at IU and the amount of obligations he was going to have. And, people questioning him when he's not doing well, and him saying, basically taking the attitude of, I've been in the NBA, I know what I'm doing, So I would again assume that they're going to try and do again what they tried to do the last time, and have somebody who is poised, understands all the responsibilities that come with being an Indiana's head coach. I've said for a long time, You're Indiana's head coach. Half your job is coaching, recruiting, all that stuff, and half your job is being a politician. Yeah. And somebody has to be. That was one thing Archie Miller did not want. And quite frankly, I think it's something that Brad Stevens doesn't want anything to do with. And so I think that when you're looking at what's coming for Indiana, you're going to have somebody who is polished, can talk to the media, can deal with fans, can deal with boosters, can deal with all of those things while also being a good head coach. It's a unicorn. They're tough to find, those guys. And the guys that are like that are usually on very big contracts at very good schools and are winning consistently. So it's tough to find that guy. You've got to find one. And we'll see if they land the guy that fits all of those qualities. But I agree with you, Mike. I think that the rule of opposites is a great guideline for what's coming next. And we'll see. It's a tough tightrope to walk for Indiana to get everything you want. And it's like any of those shows where people are trying to buy a house on television, trying to find every little thing we want from a house. You're usually going to have to give something up to get the thing you want. And I feel like that's the position Indiana's in right now. Maybe they land that perfect guy, but more often than not, a coaching search, you land a guy, there's something missing that you want. And you just hope that that's only missing because of the situation he was in, not because he can't do it.
Yeah. That's a good way to end segment 1. When we come back on segment 2, we will talk about what to look for. What factors actually matter in a coaching search? Next on X's and Joe's.
Welcome back to X's and Joe's. I'm Bob Moats with my good friend Mike Wiemuth and our good friend Ryan Phillips from the Assembly Call to kind of go over what we're expecting, what to expect during a coaching search. And I was thinking about, like, when we were talking about segment 2, I was thinking about part of this is cracking a code. And I always think of the greatest code cracking in American history, or maybe world history, was figuring out what the Japanese were going to attack on Midway and figuring out what AF was. And then confirming that by asking the magic question of, they found the one piece that could confirm it, which was, we're going to say that Midway's desalinization efforts are down. And the Japanese on cue just said, desalinization at AF is down. So I guess it's not going to be the Aleutian Islands or Hawaii, or Coney Island was the third one they actually had figured out. I read that someplace. Yeah. That's what they had narrowed it down to. Okay, so we know that where this is going to be. So what are the data points? And I will kind of start with this, why this kind of goes here. I'm going to ask Mike to throw the charts up. And we're going to I want to walk through that real quick, because we did one of these a year ago and it looked exactly the same. And this is in all of Division I, the coaching tenures. So what we're looking at here is, it's kind of hard sometimes to get a good read on coaches, because oftentimes these tenures are very short, very, very unstable. Almost 2/3, 60% of your coaches and if you don't see it, we'll have it in the show notes, but 60% of your coaches are in 4 years or below, and 4 seasons or below in their tenure. And then another quarter of them, so almost 85% of your coaches have 10 years or less at a job. So the generational coach is really, really, really hard to find. And if you go on to, and I decided to run Power 5, just say, why not? Let's just look at the major conferences, the bigs, as well as, the ACC and SEC. And it's almost identical. I thought maybe at some of the bigger, because you got bigger contracts, you see less black, more gold, you see more that are in that 6 to 10. No, what's happening is, even at the big jobs, you still have a lot of guys who are on one class of, if a freshman played for them and they're their senior year, they may not be there fairly fair, at that point. So there's constant turnover in these jobs. I went ahead and looked at the Big Ten just because, why not? And that time I did see more black than gold. Makes a lot of sense. If you look at 21 and above,
let's be real. It's because the Big Ten hires really good coaches. Look at the landscape of the conference right now. There are a lot of good coaches in the conference.
21 and above is Izzo. 16 through 20 is Painter. Painter's going to move up to that red next year. He's going to be at, I think he starts his 21st season. Fran will probably be gone out of the 3 who are 11 through 15. Fran's maybe retiring at the end of the year. Chris Collins is in that group. And then you have a bunch of guys 5 through 10 who have been sitting around. But Ryan's right. There's a lot of really good coaches in the Big Ten. It's a well-coached league. And I think that the recruiting profile there also helps the Big Ten, helps coaches stay in the Big Ten longer. And that's where I think if IU can find a generational coach and find somebody that can flip the script, especially getting higher level wings, like we were talking about before the break. If you can find a guy that can bring higher level wings, shooters, drivers into the conference where you're getting more SEC types of players in those positions versus traditional Big Ten players. Because I think we all notice a difference when we watch an SEC game or a Big 12 game and a Big 10 game, just as the quality of wing play. If you can get a guy that, and maybe you do get a guy from the Big 12 that steps over, you can maybe see someone that could jump in and be able to be like, okay, we can make this happen. And we can actually raise the talent level because of revenue sharing. We can raise that, where the reputation of the Big Ten being a bruiser conference can be more mitigated. You don't have to do as much as you had to do. Let's say you're going in the SEC, you don't have to do as much in the Big Ten. But I think if you did enough of that in the Big Ten, you could definitely set the conference on its ear a bit.
You know, what that chart tells me is that schools are making a lot of bad hires. And not necessarily bad hires, but hires that aren't successful. Because sometimes
it don't work. Sometimes it doesn't work.
Yeah. Sometimes
Archie Miller didn't work.
Yeah.
Archie Miller didn't work.
Yeah. And the thing with Archie Miller is Dayton was his level. He was probably could have stayed at Dayton for 25 years and been very successful. And some guys just aren't built for the next level. And there's no shame in that. You know, I mean, that's just where you're at. And not every move up is a good move. And so, I think that in what I said, last year about Mike Woodson, I said that if you're at a place like Indiana and you have the resources you have and you recognize the guy you have cannot win a national championship, get rid of him as soon as possible because you're wasting time. And that's why I was an advocate of moving on from Mike Woodson last year and had a great offseason. Indiana did. Brought in a lot of talent, brought in a lot of players that could play at a high level, had proven to play at a high level, had a lot of talent, all of that. And look where we're at. It's not a national championship caliber team, despite the talent. And if you're at any school, quite frankly, and you can't win a conference tournament with the guy you have, get out of there. Get out of there as fast as possible. Pay the buyout, move on, because you got to give yourself as many shots at the right guy as you can get before you get the right guy. Indiana's fired a lot of shots over the last 20 years to try and get the right guy and has missed a lot. And so, but eventually you're going to get it right. I mean, the law of averages says eventually you're going to get it right. And so I get that seeing all of those short tenures leads you to believe, the bad hire thing, but it also leads you to believe that a lot of athletic directors are saying he's not the guy. We got to go find the guy. And specifically in the Big Ten, a major conference, if you cannot compete for the upper half of the conference consistently, or the upper third of the conference consistently, you got to get out. There's too much money at stake for you to continue living in the bottom of the conference or bottom half of the conference. And so I think that what you look at when you see the Big Ten, and that's what we're really concerned with, are the numbers from the Big Ten, is you see a lot of very good coaches. I mean, Chris Collins is a very good coach. He's been attached to Indiana potentially. I don't really want him to be Indiana's head coach, but that's a guy who's doing a really good job with a lack of resources at Northwestern. There are guys in this conference. Steve Peichel was great at Rutgers. I mean, for what Rutgers is basketball-wise, that guy brings out a tough, hard-nosed team every single time. And it's a dogfight every time you play them. He's great for what that is. It's just a program that's not going to win a ton. And you just, when you have those situations, you need to bring in a coach that can out-coach those coaches. And it's a great conference of coaches. And so I think that that's why you're seeing so many guys get kicked out quickly, because if you can't hang, you can't hang. And it's obvious you can't hang, you need to go. And I would encourage Indiana to find a guy who can hang. I mean, you got whatever you do, even if you don't get your top guy, your second guy, your third guy, get somebody who can hang in this conference, because you don't want to be doing this again in 4 years. You don't want to do it again in 6 years. You need a guy who can be here for a long time and establish himself and build something. And I think that the evidence of that was Tom Crean built the program. It started to go very up and down after Zeller and Oladipo and those guys left. It was very yo-yo. But because of the culture he built in 2015-16, they got a team that won a Big Ten championship. So the being able to establish a culture leads to, even if things are going badly, there's always the chance that it comes back up. You have to get a guy who can build something like that long term and not be, people were talking about, Patino and that's never going to happen. But people were talking about, why not Patino? It's like, because he's gone in 4 years. You're not looking to do this again. So you got to shoot the moon, as you said earlier. You got to shoot the moon and find the guy who's going to be here and establish something of his own for a long period of time, and a guy who has proven that he can hang with guys like a Chris Collins, like a Tom Izzo, like these guys who are excellent coaches, who are here, who are entrenched. You're going to be going up against them on the recruiting trail, and then you're going to play them multiple times a year in the conference. You have to be able to prove yourself there. And Indiana hasn't had that guy for quite some time.
Yeah, I'll follow up with what you said, Ryan, about moving on quickly. I think in the past, fans and the media really did look at coaching tenures minimally like a presidential administration. They get 4 years. You have to give them 4 years. Unless they do something awful and we can, technically impeach them. But it was always assumed that 4 years was like the standard unit of measure for a coach. I think now when we can look into, there's so much data available now versus then, that the ability to make predictive, to put together information that shows some predictive correlations around whether a coach will actually achieve X level of success well before 4 years has completely changed, I think, the dynamics of looking at whether you can actually afford to hang on for another 4 years. Bob and I did a pod, I guess, it was 2 episodes ago, Bob, where we talked about like the 10 factor 10 prediction factors that, I found looking at multiple coaching tenures across college football and college basketball. You can see now, and I can look at let's say any coach. You can hand me the stats of a coach. You can hand me what program they're at, what the expectations of the program. I can go on the fan websites and figure out, okay, this is where the fan sentiment is here in month 18 of this coaching tenure. You can tell now with much greater accuracy whether a guy is going to make it or not, well before you get to even year 3 sometimes. The honeymoon now is so different. So seeing the trajectory of where a coach is as they're coming out of year 2, you can make some really strong assessments of the chance of this guy actually, zooming up the conference ranks, or if they're just going to crash out, once they get to year 3 and 4, once the honeymoon ends, once the recruiting bump ends with the honeymoon. Now you see exactly what athletic directors get to look at. They see the momentum dying with some of these coaches, and I think a lot of fans and media have still not caught up to the fact that, like what Ryan said, you're right. You just can't afford to wait anymore. It's just too costly.
Well, and I think specific to Indiana, if you're a coach, the finances, the NIL money, all of that muscle makes your job easier and makes it a lot harder at the same time, because you got to win. There's no excuse of this, well, I got to get my own players cycled in here. We heard with Archie Miller for a long time, well, I'm completely changing the system, so I got to get my own guys, blah, blah. That doesn't exist anymore. You can have a completely new roster from one season to next. I don't think that's the way to build a championship, but you can establish your vision very quickly, and you have the money at IU to do it. But that also puts you on the hook very quickly to perform. And there's also a lot of donors who are spending a lot of money, or, hey, I expect results for the cash that I'm pouring out. This is not a charity. And I think that with Indiana as well, I would say because of all those resources, they can't miss again. They can't. They cannot miss again. And the reason why is that every year you are further away from success, from like past success, your fan base shrinks just a little bit. And it's and you can always get them back. But the people that pay attention, that throw their heart and soul, that watch things like this or assembly call or whatever, shrinks just a little bit. Even if it's 10 people over time, it's more. And eventually people don't care anymore. And like we've said several times, there is so much money at stake these days that if you're an athletic department and you make the wrong hire, you deserve to be fired. You have the resources to make the right hire. You know, you should have a guy at the top in Scott Dolson. I mean, he did a great job getting Curt Cignetti. He's got to do that in basketball too. And I've said this repeatedly on assembly call. Curt Cignetti is a cornerstone hire for Indiana University, for the football program, for all of that. Scott Dolson will be judged by this basketball hire. That is what his legacy will be, is this basketball hire. And Cignetti's great. The football program is in great hands, all that stuff. But Indiana's about basketball, and he will be remembered for what he does over the next couple of weeks. No pressure, Scott, but that's what we're going to judge you by. And you know, go ahead.
There has not been another human though better prepared for this based on the last 35 years of his life than Scott Dolson.
Probably not.
If one person has been put in this position, if there are fates that conspire to put one man in a place to make this call, to understand it, and I was telling somebody earlier today, we're just kind of talking, you know, Scott Dolson knows who everybody is. It's not that we know Scott Dolson, it's that he knows everybody in the state of Indiana. He was grassroots for so long inside the IU community. Like if you had an alumni event anywhere if you had 10 people in an alumni event, Scott Dolson was there representing Varsity Club. That's where he was in the 90s and the 2000s. And so he knows what this fan base, I think, desires, what they want. I think he knows that, Ryan, that this is going to be his seminal moment. That's like, I've got to get this one right. I've got to make for damn sure that this next hire I have in basketball, it's going to define really where we go for the next 20 years, including what happens potentially with football, just because at some point with Curt Cignetti, you know, in the next 10 years from now, we're be looking at a different situation inside football. You know, even though it's a cornerstone hire, I agree with it 1,000%. It's definitely changed not just the direction, but also just changed everything about where things are going. I do think at this point, Scott Dolson's put in a position where he knows that this is the moment. And especially with revenue sharing, like I use NIL advantage, quote unquote, is now mitigated by the fact that we're going into not an era of NIL, but an era of player compensation. And it's going to look entirely different. And they know they've got to get all of this right. They've got to get the right guy at the helm to do it. And that puts a lot on the table. It also means, but I think this is a program that has a lot. I don't think fans fully appreciate the differences what IU has versus when Fran leaves at Iowa, the package that gets handed to whoever his replacement is, let's say it's Ben McCollum, his package is going to look a lot different than what the package of the guy at Indiana is going to look like.
Right.
You know, at Iowa, he may be fourth. At this point, the Iowa men's basketball program may be fourth in the hierarchy when it gets right down to it, behind football, behind women's basketball, and behind wrestling. That there are going to be people in Iowa that say, we want good basketball, but we're elite at wrestling, and we want to put more to that. So basketball, you can do with 500,000 less or $1 million less, because we want to have the best wrestling program in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a completely fair point, and I think that, you know, I have said since the beginning, and I'm not pointing to any one person. I've said this several times, and I'm not pointing to a coach in this or trying to allude to anyone specific, but I think there is a really good chance, better than maybe 40%, I would say, chance that the next coach in Indiana comes completely out of left field from a successful program that you would never expect they'd leave. And the reason why is because the things you can do at Indiana, you just can't do at a lot of these jobs. I mean, you just can't financially. You can't. No. And if somebody isn't getting the support they think they deserve, we may not have even heard about it, but they may not think that they're getting the support they need. And so they decide to leave, and it's a left field hire. I mean, pointing to the thing with Lincoln Riley I referenced before, like nobody saw that coming. and that happens these days. Guys from out of nowhere will go somewhere. Calipari going to Arkansas. We expected potentially Calipari to step down and maybe take some time off and wait for the next big job. Didn't expect him to walk across, state lines to a rival SEC program. Nobody expected that. And so these things happen, and they are happening more and more often based on support, based on how people feel, based on the pressure they feel from fans, like whatever it is. I would not be shocked if Indiana's next hire is sort of a wait, what kind of hire? There's the usual suspects that we've seen on all the coaching lists that are the potential, next guy to step up or step sideways or whatever we're going to call it to Indiana that have ties, that have connections, whatever. But there's also a real good chance it's something that we are all just looking at each other like, how did that happen? In a couple weeks. And I think there is that's less about Indiana and more about the climate we're in related to what Indiana has. It's less about just the IU job, but it's more that.
I'm having this Ray Spruance moment of 3 of the 4. We sunk 3 of the 4 in 8 minutes. How the hell does this happen? We got all 3 of we know where the 4th is. Winner. Oh, it's like best. It's like best day ever sort of thing. But I do see your point that where this thing could come out of left field. Not saying it will, but
I'm not saying it will either. But I mean,
there's a shot at it.
That's the climate.
A viable shot at that.
Yeah, that's the climate we're in. It
so,
really
Mike,
is.
as you got another theory that you just developed, and yet you pitched it today with Alex. Heard you talk about it today. I think that. And Zach Osterman, wrote a great article, and a friend of mine asked me about it, and I said, "Well, Mike actually drilled it down to 1. Mike's drilled it down to one indice at this point as to where he is." And it makes all the sense in the world, because when I think of what I want in a coach, a guy that wins,
right.
Your best indicator is, let's just take all the analytics, throw it out the window. Does the guy win or not? And winning is not necessarily 25-10, and you got lucky, and you made it to a Sweet 16 or Elite 8. Winning is, do you consistently overproduce or produce at a higher elite level? Obviously, or let's say relative to your conference, if you're an Atlantic 10 team, do you bring your group into the top 15% every year? Yeah. That would be an example of an A10 coach or a Mountain West coach that does that well. Right. If you're at a non-basketball school and you're consistently, not every once in a while jumping into the top 15, but let's say you're a South Carolina and you're contending in the SEC for 5-10 years, that would be a very impressive thing for me. Sure. But I think there's a way to look at that numerically, is what you're kind of going with.
Yeah, I mean, as looking at this and looking at the data and trying to correlate it to teams that actually win, and distinguishing between the decisions that ADs can make between coaches with different profiles, where they come from, and trying to figure out, okay, well, is there some indicator out there that can give us a sense of whether this guy is going to be, like what Ryan says, the one who's going to stay for a while, be there for a decade plus, and move you to the top of the conference totem pole. As a general rule, what I found, you want to look for a coach that elevated their prior programs above those programs' circumstances. I mean, by circumstances, prestige, money, however you want to describe what, let's say, the relative power position that school has versus their rivals. And that happens both in terms of wins and recruiting. And that's a key point I want to focus on also, is like recruiting. Can you get guys that your school usually does not get? And so there's no perfect stat that can predict with absolute certainty that a coaching candidate will win, let's say, at like a title level or a Final Four level. But there's one that comes close. And it's a simple yes, no, checkbox kind of question. And it basically goes like this. From at least one of their prior head coaching positions, did the coach set the all-time season win total record for that program? Yes or no? And if you look back to the 1960s, from now going back to the 1960s, every NCAA title winning coach, except one, checked that box.
Who's the one?
Take a guess. I know the answer.
Is it what's his name at UConn?
No. This is for people that have a prior coaching record.
A prior
so
coaching.
Like Joby Hall doesn't count because Joby Hall ascended as an assistant. Denny Crum doesn't count because he
Tom
ascended as an
Izzo,
assistant.
same thing. Yeah.
So you got to take those guys off the list.
Yeah.
Who didn't
check that box in the last 60 plus years?
I have no idea.
Who would be the one you would least expect?
I gotta think. I was gonna say no. I don't know. I'm drawing a complete blank.
Mike Krzyzewski.
Who was? Wow.
He did not.
That's insane.
He did not. He stayed at Army for a very short time.
And he wasn't there very long.
And he did not break. And Bobby Knight was the one that set the record at Army.
That is an outstanding trivia question. Because I always forget he wasn't in Army very long. I also forget that there are times I forget that he was at Army because it was so like when you look at his like bio, it's so much Duke, and then it's that little sliver of Army. Exactly. That's a great call.
Yeah. So I mean, so that stat alone has, like in this case, just going back to the 60s, has a 95% hit rate for correlation. So it obviously tells you something. And it just gave me an example of this. And actually I'll throw up many examples here. This is just
the list.
A rundown of the coaches that won national championships and the schools that they were at and the number of wins that they achieved that broke the record, or at least the standing record at that school at that time for the most.
And it just has to be at one of their schools before
one of their. It could be more. There's some guys that have done it more than once. Bruce Pearl, literally every single place Bruce Pearl has gone, he's broken the record.
Now I would throw out a correlation, and this is we may have this out for about a minute, Mike, just for the hell of it.
Sure.
I will throw out an amendment that suggests that maybe we should consider, if you've tied the record, it could also be under consideration.
I think we're getting to like trying to nudge the numbers as I would suggest yes. I mean that's in the ballpark. Let's say
if you're talking 29 wins, you're talking 29 wins. I mean, we're not going to quibble over the fact that now granted you can say whether it's a longer season, yada yada, whatever. But the point is, you know where I'm going with this. I think that doesn't that put both Cronin and McDermott into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking for exclusions, then obviously you can say that. All right, the qualification could come in, but I was literally just setting the mark based upon what the national championship level coaches were doing.
Right. The ones that won one,
they were not tying the records; they were breaking the record.
Norm Sloan winning 18 games at Florida. Man, what was going on with Florida's basketball program before he got there?
They had a program.
He may have been I think Norm was their first full-time coach.
Was he?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, because that had to be like 1960.
We were going back, and back in those days, Ryan, the SEC oftentimes handed their programs over to an assistant football coach for an extra $700 and use of the car for a little longer.
I just think that he was Florida's first full-time basketball coach.
I think he was. If it wasn't him, it was damn close. Okay, it was. Okay, so he was their first. Yeah.
That was very common back then. You're right, Bob. Yeah. In the South, even in like smaller schools, Bobby Bowden actually coached Samford University's basketball team without any experience coaching basketball.
He's just running the veer with a basketball.
Exactly.
Boys,
all right.
We're going to run the point guard out here to the baseline, and we're going to throw it over to him.
He would joke. He would say, 14-14 is pretty good record, right? 14 games, 14 losses. Yeah. So noting on this, and looking at the the records that you see here, obviously, this goes back into, John Wooden breaking the Indiana State University record. So obviously this, has some degree of traction over time. What's relevant, I guess, just looking at the Indiana University situation is that when you ask the question, okay, looking at IU's recent hires, over time. When was the last time IU had a coach that checked this box? The answer is Bobby Knight.
Yeah.
Archie Miller did not hit the mark. Tom Crean didn't hit the mark. Even Kelvin Sampson didn't hit the mark.
That's surprising to me.
Well, thanks Billy Tubbs. That was because Billy Tubbs made a national championship with Oklahoma in '88.
Yeah.
So you're good, but you're not to that level that Mike's talking about.
Yeah, and so that's just the winning side, and that's important. I think what it's really, if you're trying to explain this just outside the numbers, like, okay, why does this matter? Well, why is this a predictive measure that seems to indicate, like, okay, coaches that fit this box seem to achieve more than the guys that don't fit that box? I think it just indicates that guys that elevate programs at the top level typically have to demonstrate that they can do it at the bottom level as well, at a lower like echelon school. And that capacity is like very specific, that the same skill sets that is required to take a MAC team or a team in like the Atlantic 10 or whatever these schools conferences are. The same skill set it takes to like break the record at those smaller schools are basically the same skill sets you need to break it at the bigger schools. And when you move up, you have more resources, more prestige, at your disposal, more media attention. So utilizing those skills allows you to become like, the next heavy at that school. And also the corollary to that is if you're a coach that doesn't have those skill sets, you probably are not going to be able to break records at the lower echelon schools. And then if you're a pretty good coach, you're a good coach, but not quite at the level of actually breaking records at your prior school, you get hired at the next level. Seems to be a pretty strong correlation that suggests that you're probably not going to break records at the big school.
I mean, it all fits. I mean, it's success begets success. And so if you know how to win, most of these guys, if you know how to win, you know how to win. Yeah. And it's very much about, recruiting is a huge part of the job. I would say recruiting at a high level, a place like Indiana, just because of the players you're going to go against or on the opposing teams, you need to recruit at a high level. Yeah. On top of that, you need to develop at a high level, which often gets forgotten. The development piece often gets forgotten. And people think, well, you got the players. It's like, no, the amount of change between a high schooler and a senior in college is massive. And so, you can get a Carmelo Anthony who could dominate those guys, but that's rare. Cooper Flagg is not walking through everybody's front door. And so, but I would say the other thing about that is recruiting and development is huge. But knowing how to coach and having a system that you can fit players to, and that you're also, I think a big key is willing to adjust the system if you don't have your perfect mix of players. Right. So I think that's one thing that Dan Hurley has done so well at UConn is being able to take what he's doing, but also adjust it, tweak it just a little to make it fit the exact roster he has and the guys he's able to bring in. Because guess what? You're not going to get your dream recruit every year. You're not going to get your dream recruit every year. You're not going to get your dream roster every year. But you still got to win every year, and so being able to win and having a program set up that is built to win, that translates. It translates from small schools to big schools to, the NBA to wherever, if you know how to coach. And I think that's fair. What I will say is there's probably a lot of guys who set the record at their school who wound up flopping at the next level because of the same reason we said that was their level. So it takes us, it's not only, the smaller school was where they belonged. And so I think that it takes not only the success that you're pointing out, but also getting the right guy who is able to make that step up. So I think that's a great stat, and it's a genius find by you. But at the same time, it's not just picking that guy; it's picking the guy that can fit.
Well, and that's
it's one stat
whose wins will travel. Basically,
if you're looking at creating a short list, if you're looking at what, because I think so many times you look at like the Holloway hire at Seton Hall is a prime example of this. He did something amazing. I believe it was St. Peter's when they went through, or you kind of go and even Crean kind of looks at this to a certain degree. where he had that Final Four run, or Archie with the Elite Eight run. You go down these guys, it doesn't always translate because stuff goes bad. Stuff goes belly up. It's just part of the nature of the beast. So as we kind of go with this, before we kind of take the break, because there's also reasons why things go belly up, and like situation like Billy Clyde Gillespie is a prime example. Chris Beard at Texas. Larry Eustachny is one of my personal favorites because the RV pictures to this day, I still think the fact the man went to games in an RV might be a good indicator that you may not want to put this guy with too much responsibility.
Some problems there. Yeah.
We'll put that in the show notes. Don't worry. We'll put those pics in the show notes.
Those pics. I mean, I thought that talking about a guy that was living his best life. But all of these kind of factor into this thing where I think that there are those things of traits in the coaches that I'll just put it this way. If the guy's out at 3:30 in the morning, time in, time out in small college towns, it's going to get back to ADs. That's what the search firms are going to find. And if you're asking a question of why some programs aren't talking to somebody, I'm not saying it's happening, but if there's been a history of it, you may get that sort of question.
Exactly.
And I don't know. I mean, win, lose or draw. Just real quick, guys. I think there are some personal habits, and when it gets right down to it, definitely impact on court performance.
Oh, no question. No question. I think that, that starts to show through, and I think that having a stable person is almost as important as having a stable coaching record. And those kind of things show eventually, and they shine through.
Yeah. There are a lot of crazy coaches, but it's all incremental, right? Like you want a little bit of crazy.
You want Kurt Signetti crazy. You want a little.
Dial it back crazy, not go missing for 72 hours on a bender crazy.
Yeah,
it's
really funny.
Bob Huggins, where he likes to collect beer cans as the excuse. That's what I'm talking about.
When I was actually working at the Columbus Republic, I sat at an event next to it was an Indiana football game. I sat next to a veteran reporter, and we just started talking about like dealing with coaches and interviews and stuff like that. And he's like, the amount of guys in these jobs who are functional alcoholics is insane. Like the percentage of people who are, and it's probably not alcohol anymore. It's probably something else. But it's such a stressful situation that like any of those negative traits will eventually break through the dam. The dam will eventually break, and that will eventually come out. And, it's such a high pressure job. It's 365-day a year job that if you have those personal bugaboos, it's not going to stay hidden for long.
No. So when we come back, we're going to kind of quickly wrap up this conversation and just and go through IU and have a brief tribute to a man that brought us a great deal of joy throughout his acting career. When we come back on X's and Joe's.
And welcome back to X's and Joe's. I'm Mike Wiemuth, joined by Coach Bob Moats and our guest Ryan Phillips. So, gentlemen, we're in another search season. We've gone through sort of the schematics of like, okay, the information wind tunnel that we all have to look at, looking at sort of the metrics and stats that may correlate to some degree of success. Maybe let's just talk about just a few individuals that have come up during the search. Bob, I'll kick it to you. Are there any particular, what are friends for, Bob?
Because the answer.
So, Bob, tell us, tell us the final answer of who Indiana absolutely is going to pick, and and what level of success you guarantee that they will have once they are picked.
So there's this guy I know coaching junior high basketball out of Silver Creek. He's really good. He knows Trey Kaufman-Renn pretty well, and I think he's going to win a natty. I know I have a source down there that keeps sending me messages. No, I think that if we're looking for the home run hire, there's the two out of the Big 12. There's TJ, and then there's obviously Scott Drew's probably the second. Really the first one on that list. That if there's a shot at Scott Drew, if this happens, I mean, I think that take everything else outside of it. You don't do what he did at Baylor, where you move. He's in an era of agents where when he first got to campus, they needed defense attorneys. And he turned that program into a national champion out of a school that, I mean, I don't think they knew what a basketball was before Scott Drew really came to campus. Right. I think that there are structural issues inside the Big 12 right now, as well as the ACC, but really the Big 12 more or less than anybody. I think there's some structural issues in the Big 12 that actually are going to kind of make the Big 10 and SEC jobs much more exciting. Yeah. And I think they can thank Texas and Oklahoma for doing that for them. But I do think at the end of the day, Scott Drew has so much going offensively in particular. And I think that he plays a style of defense that's completely different than what we saw in the last 8 years. Take his tempo out the window. He runs transition 15% of the time. That's plenty. He just runs good stuff on offense, and it takes a couple seconds longer than other guys. So he doesn't settle for quick shots like other programs will. So I think a lot of it comes down with Scott Drew that, he would be the one at this point that it's like, okay, you want your moonshot? There's Scott Drew. I think TJ's close. I think TJ's orbiting, not landing the moon. I think he's Apollo 8, not Apollo 11. But I think he'd be a good one too in that regard. I think he's at that moment. He's at a moment where he can really do some good.
Yeah.
Ryan, what about you? Anybody? Where are you at?
Well, I'll talk about one of your Scott Drew. The thing that scares me is, he won a national championship, and I'm not discounting that. It's incredible, but he hasn't had a ton of tournament success. He went to 2 Elite Eights in the early 2010s, and then since then he hasn't gotten out of the second round since he won that title. So that kind of scares me, as I know he puts up wins, and his teams were 23-11, 24-11. They're 16-10 this year. He hasn't had a ton of success, and I know it's at Baylor. I know people are going to talk about that, but there's a lot of money at Baylor too. They built him his own arena, all that stuff. That it scares me a little. I think that he knows how to coach. That's not the problem. It's how successful can he be? TJ Otzelberger is a guy. I think that he's probably top on my list now with the people who have bowed out and made it very clear. I mean, Dusty May is, there are people still holding on to the Dusty May thing. That's not happening. You don't sign an extension if you're planning to talk to other people. Otzelberger, I think, would be a great coach for Indiana. He's got deep ties to Iowa State. He's been an assistant there twice. He's got family ties. I don't know if he's leaving, even for Indiana. He's gettable, but I don't know if he's leaving. So Greg McDermott gets talked about a lot, but that's another guy that feels a little bit like I know he's had success for a really long time, but that feels also like another sort of Archie Miller thing. It seems like he's at the right spot for him. Like he at the right spot, and that doesn't mean he can't coach. It just means I think that fit is so perfect for him. So if you're asking me who I think is going to be the next head coach of India, I have no freaking idea, guys. I really don't, because every candidate you can list the positives and negatives, and also the reasons why they wouldn't come. Mm-hmm. And so there's no slam dunk hire here, and slam dunk, not meaning they wouldn't be successful, just meaning that it all fits and makes sense and it's the perfect deal. I think Dusty May was that last year, and they didn't get rid of Mike Woodson. They had, an opportunity to probably, there are 2 guys they could have had last year they can't get this year, and that was Bruce Pearl and Dusty May. And, they waited a year too long, and that's why we go back to that thing about, when get out. When it's bad, get out. Don't wait. You don't owe anybody anything. You're going to pay them to go away. You don't owe anybody anything. You got to make your move when you're ready to make your move. So I don't know. I really don't. And it's hard for me to make a prediction at this point, just because it's so early. In 2 weeks, I'll email you guys with my prediction. But right now I don't know where this is going. I really don't. And we'll see. I'd imagine that Otzelberger is going to get a really hard look. I'd imagine, as you said, Scott Drew is definitely going to get a conversation. And I know he values the Indiana job very highly. I've heard from people that, Louisville and Kentucky looked at him, and he definitely values IU as a higher level job than that. Makes sense. He's from here. but whether or not he'll take it, I don't know. So we'll see. Dusty May felt the same way, actually. I mean, Dusty May, both those jobs, they were interested in Dusty May, and he looked past them and went to Michigan.
Yeah.
What do you think, Mike?
Where are you at, Mike? Yeah, I know your answer too. If there's a one, no, you need to say it. I want to hear you say it because I know he's he is your USS flag. He always has been. There's always been one. There's always been one for Mike.
Yeah. So Scott Drew would be, if you could get him, if you gave me a wish and said, okay, who do you want at IU? Who do you think has the best probability of winning at IU? I would probably pick Drew. Since I talked about him yesterday on the other pod, I think I have to almost petition Jared to lift my my weekly limit the number of times I can actually discuss Scott Drew in any sort of public forum. So
I'll put in a good word for you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll have to do a quick submission after this is over. But yeah, Drew, I think he really covers a lot of the problems that Indiana's had. And also he correlates to what I think resembles not only what will make IU fans happy, but what will also win basketball games at a pretty decent level. He plays modern offense. His teams hit a lot of threes in terms of accuracy. Not necessarily takes a ton, but when his teams are good, they hit a ton of threes. Look at the 2021 championship team they had. All four of his starting wings and guards were hitting over 40%. That, like, of all the national championship teams you've seen the last 10 years, I think that would make IU fans just giggle with joy. If that was their team, it would probably be that Baylor team. So, and he also recruits extremely well at the high school and portal venues, which I think you need to have nowadays to compete for championships. You can't be too committed to one or the other. You have to have one big foot inside of high school and also another big foot inside of the portal. So he's been sort of at the top of my list. I would probably say Otzelberger would probably be number two. I think he is, a lot of what I see in him is kind of like a metric wise, and also just kind of the teams and players he recruits. Reminds me a little of Bruce Pearl early on in his career. Pearl kind of would go back and forth. He had a kind of a good defensive team, but the offense would kind of lag behind and it would kind of go back and forth. Now you see Pearl's basically getting his offense and defense coordinated now. Otzelberger has always had great defenses. They're always top 10. They may be maybe possibly the best defensive coach in the country right now. But you're starting to see his offense is starting to tick up every year as he's been in Ames, Iowa. So I think he's a guy that has a lot of capacity to possibly become the next big time coach within college basketball, like a top 5 coach, going forward. So those are my top 2. And, I'm sticking with that. That's my hope. I don't know if that's actually going to take place, but we'll see.
Who knows? Well, what we do know is that we're not going to get a guy brought in from cooking on a ship for a while after being fired from his last college job. We know that that's not in the cards. But Gene Hackman, I believe from Danville, Indiana, I believe was where he was born and raised.
Well, he was born in California, but he moved to Danville.
He graduated from Danville High School. I knew that.
Yes,
much.
He did.
So,
I think it's from San Bernardino and then out to I think he went to Danville, then Iowa, then back to California, I think. Yeah.
So, just as a note, Hoosiers, I think I love the movie. There may be times where I never criticize Hoosiers itself. What I criticize are what some people try to do with it sometimes. Mike and I for years have said it's not a documentary. It's not that it's a beautiful, heartwarming story, but for somebody that, but I think that, his portrayal, I think when we talk about coaching, a lot of people look at that as kind of like maybe the best depiction of a coach on a movie was Gene Hackman and Hoosiers.
Yeah. Well, for me, it's that, and then Wilford Brimley in The Natural are the screen coach manager. Yeah. And by the way, both should have been nominated for Oscars. I will
1,000%.
And I think that there should have been I will die on this hill, but sports movies get overlooked for Academy Awards way too often.
Agreed.
The other ones I will point to are Tim McGraw in Friday Night Lights. I wanted to hate him. He was phenomenal, and he channeled his father, quite frankly. And then Dennis Hopper in Hoosiers also should have been nominated. So that's my little rant on sports movies not getting enough love.
Do you know? Do you guys remember who was the number one choice for as I guess by the production team to play the Gene Hackman character in that movie, Coach Norman Dale, who the first choice was?
No.
Jack Nicholson.
That would have been.
Can you imagine?
That would have been crazy. I don't know if it would have been good, but it would have been crazy.
I don't know if Indiana would have survived. I mean,
Dennis Hopper and Jack Nicholson in that, like in those roles.
And they're good friends. That's part of it.
I know the stories of Sinatra and Dean Martin in Madison doing Some Came Running. I think Hopper and Nicholson, that would have been an A-bomb compared to that just conventional weapon.
I just can't. I'm just having trouble seeing that. Can you imagine, like,
I can't know.
Coach, you're missing a player. My team's on the floor.
Yeah. Well, my team is on the floor.
Welcome to Indiana basketball. Yeah. We also, there's like the second story behind this. Do you ever hear the kind of behind the scenes chatter about Hackman's view of the movie?
Didn't Hackman look at Hopper and say, "You better have invested well, because you're never going to work again after this turkey"?
Exactly.
Did you say that?
Oh yeah. You see in the montage of, like, one of the scenes where the team's doing well when Jimmy joins the team, and there's a scene where, like, Hopper's kind of laughing because Hackman said something to him, and Hopper actually told Angelo Pizzo later on, like, "Oh yeah, what he said is basically what Bob says, like, this movie is going to sink us both. I hope you invested well."
Welcome to the end of our careers.
So he was. So
the legendary Keith Olbermann quote from the first night of ESPN2, where he was he's wearing a leather. They made him wear like a leather jacket, whatever. The opening lines in the history of ESPN2 was Keith Olbermann saying, "Welcome to the end of our careers." One of my favorite stories ever.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, the funny thing is, like, what happened, like, at the end of it was, at least this is what Pizzo said, is that they took Hackman aside after the movie, like, finally shot, and they screened, I guess, the version of the movie that was going to go to, like, final print. It had the musical score was added, so it was basically the final movie. And again, Hackman had been just, like, saying all throughout, like, even at the final shoot, is like, yeah, this movie is gonna suck and it's gonna kill us all. They screened the movie, and after the movie, like, the lights come back on, Hackman turns to Pizzo and said, "How the hell did you do that?"
Yeah.
He was blown away by, when you add the musical score and all the things that, kind of, like, really make Hoosiers a great movie. Yeah, it all kind of came together. And then after that, he was like, it's a great movie. What can I say?
Well, it's funny, him to say that to Hopper is so funny, because Hopper did get nominated for an Oscar for that. He didn't win, but he should have. But he got nominated, and it's just like, and I think it got nominated for best music to, like, original score. So that makes sense. I think
Jerry Goldsmith did the score.
Basically, the rule on that best score Oscar is John Williams and Jerry Goldsmith always have a score up, and John Williams always wins, except for one time when Jerry Goldsmith got it. Yeah. And as we kind of go through again, I go back to the young everything from the Young Frankenstein scene where he's got where he's smoking the cigar with Peter Boyle, and the finger catches on fire, and he's the blind man. I mean, the bird cage where he comes out as an immaculately dressed woman in drag. I mean, there are the moments that you go to Unforgiven. You can go back to Bonnie and Clyde, The French Connection, obviously.
Popeye.
But the guy was legitimately funny. He was legitimately funny.
Yeah.
Even
that's so hard to do.
A very underrated movie is Crimson Tide. We were texting about this. It's an incredibly underrated movie that has a lot of great actors. James Gandolfini's in that. Viggo Mortensen. Like, there's a ton of guys in that who you watch that movie, you're like, well, hey,
I know that guy.
Yeah. And in that, like, he's the bad guy, but he's so likable. I mean, in Superman, he's Lex Luthor, and he's so likable, and you're almost kind of like,
kind of root for him.
Superman's kind of a stiff. I like this guy, and I think he was always magnetic on screen. He was such a good actor from early on in his career. But I mean, movies like, playing, movies like he was Buck Barrow in Bonnie and Clyde, a movie that's not his, but he makes such an impact on it. And then, playing Popeye Doyle in The French Connection, which is just if you've never seen that movie, please go watch it. It is so good. And he is singular in that movie. The Conversation,
that's one
Unforgiven.
of my favorites.
Yeah, The Conversation, Mississippi Burning is a phenomenal movie. But yeah, Crimson Tide. And there was a movie he did later. It was in the early 2000s, I think, called Heist. That's really good too. It's a great, it's not a creative title. It's about a heist. It's a great heist movie that I think at the end of it, it's a David Mamet, and at the end of it, you're starting to be like, I'm not going to try and outsmart this movie anymore. It's way smarter than I am, and it winds up being that way. So, just a great career, man. I mean, that's one of those guys who he hit home runs constantly the whole time.
Yep.
So, Ryan, we appreciate you coming on with us, man.
Of course, we'll do it again sometime too.
We will do this again.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, as well, we also want to thank Bob Thompson for the music and sound of the show, and special thanks of John Ringer of rigdesign.com for designing the logo and look of the show.
Yeah, looking forward. Next episode, Bob, what are we doing the next episode?
Well, I think we're going to do the tournament. We call this our tournament preview, but basically the way we frame it is what we got right and what we got wrong. Like, we're going to have to go through some of the predictions we made earlier this year and be kind of like, well, Penn State didn't turn out the way we thought it would.
Right. Luckily.
but yeah, that's what we'll do next.
Yeah.
So
look for that in about 2 weeks. So until then, this endless conversation was brought to you by the Back Home Network. Be sure to check out all the great BHN content, including Assembly Call, Doing the Work, The Dribble Drive, and Crimson Cast on YouTube and on backhomenetwork.com. So until next time, I'm Mike Wiemuth.
I'm Bob Moats.
Fight on, everybody.